Hi there. So welcome back. Last week's webinar, we had a slight gremlin in the system. So what we're doing now is we're just tying up that webinar. We're just showing the whole thing working end to end. That's the point of today. So welcome back. And so first of all, Dan, do you want to just recap on where we got to in the webinar, what the issues were, and then we'll start the demo again.
Of course. Yeah, no worries. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So we had a few issues when we tried to get everything going last week, if you remember, and that the file system connector, we were getting a HTTP 400 error. So we couldn't browse locally, and we couldn't pick things up. The trigger wasn't firing. But what we did show is how the XML Transform would work, and we got that going. So at the very end of the presentation, the webinar, I suddenly realized what I've been doing wrong, and I'm hoping, even if I make this mistake, you guys might make it as well. And what the issue was is if I try and show you what the error is, the issue that we had was in this file system connector, which is the API connection for connecting to on-prem. I had copied and pasted my username from an ARM template that I had already set up because I couldn't remember what the username was, or the computer name specifically. And in ARM, in a JSON file, you have to put 2 backslashes to escape your a backslash. So sorry, I've got too many windows open here and they're appearing on top. So my apologies if you see a black square on top of anything here at the moment. I'm trying to move things around.
No, we're all good right now.
We're all good. Brilliant. Okay. So what I pasted in last week without noticing is this, and that double backslash is invalid because when you're in an API connection, you just need that. You don't need to escape the backslash. But when you
parameterize it and you put that in the template.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. If I'm creating an ARM template or a parameter file for an ARM template, which is a JSON file, then you do need to, because a backslash is a reserved character in JSON, you have to escape it by putting 2 of them. And I didn't notice that, so that's all it was. That's why it wasn't actually connecting. So if I now put in the correct values like that, they're all done, and I hit save. Interestingly, you actually have to hit save twice. I think the first save validates the values and the second save actually saves them. Right. Now, the next thing to know is that there appears to be some caching of credentials going on, because what I was trying to do before we started today was put this back to where it was so I could recreate the error for everyone. And instead, I found that when I put it back to the way it was with the double backslash and saved it, the logic app was still working. So I'm guessing that somewhere there is a caching of credentials from the API connection used by the logic app, which eventually get refreshed. I haven't dug too deeply into that. I restarted the OPDG service and things like that, and that didn't make it go away. But it doesn't matter. They eventually catch up. So if we go back to the actual logic app now, and this is the logic app we created last week, and what we were doing in here is receiving a file. So I'd put in the folder I want to receive from, and this wasn't working, this file picker last week. When we click this, okay, we get file system, and here it should now start browsing the files on my system. Aha. Now, this is the error we got last week, if you remember.
Yeah, and that's when the credentials weren't working.
Exactly. So I've just fixed them, and I'm still getting this, which means that now, although I fixed them in the API connection, it hasn't yet picked up and refreshed it. Yeah. So first thing I'm going to do is just double check that I do have the correct credentials in here. So I'll update that again, and that might force it to stop using cache credentials. And then the other option is to tell it to use a different API connection and then come back to this one. So let's do this.
We've got to do that. Did you do that twice again?
I did, yes. You don't see it. I'm pretty quick. Right, so I'm just going to enable and disable the logic app, and I'm going to edit it, and I'm coming back in here, and I'm expecting this to still fail. because it's using a cat. Oh, no, now it's worked. Okay, there we go. Maybe enabling and disabling the logic app is the refreshing of it. So now it's working. So it's correctly picking up that I've got these two folders. Now these two actually don't match to this. When I click this button, it's not showing me, it's not browsing from this point. It's browsing from what you put in your API connection. You remember in our API connection, we've got, this is the root folder. So whatever you put in here, you can't go any higher. You can't go back up. I can't go back up to ctemp, for example. I can only start from Logic Apps Live folder inside here. However, I can put whatever I want to in here. I can go ctemp and then a different folder. I just can't access it via the picker. There we go. That's just the way it works. So what I actually want is I want the inbound folder. So we'll go back here again. I want the inbound folder. There we go. And I'm saying the maximum number of files I'll pick up in a batch is 10. I'm running every 30 seconds. I'm not going to set a start time or anything like that. And then I can save that. Alrighty. So that's now saved, and it will start picking up files. So if you remember in here, what we were doing is we were checking to see if the file name ended with .xml.
Yeah,
and then if it did,
because that file picker was just giving us the metadata.
Yes, this trigger is
meta.
just giving us the metadata. That's exactly right. It's not getting the files. Originally, you had two versions of this. You had one that would get the file and one that would just get the metadata. But it appears the Logic Apps team are moving to just metadata only, which makes more sense, especially with large files. I don't want to bring the large file in and find I don't want to process it. I mean, in an ideal world, I would use a file mask in here as well and say, well, actually, I just want files that meet these criteria. You know, starred or XML, just like we have in BizTalk. We don't have that ability in Logic Apps. We have to add in something specific. And in fact, what's here is very basic for checking. I mean, I've got, you know, these predicates in here, which is quite small. You know, if I wanted to go starred or XML, that's close enough to do. But if I wanted to do employee starred or XML, for example, I'd have to do a number of these.
You might do a containers or something like that.
Yeah, I could do, well, I do, you know, starts with employee and ends with .xml. You could do that. Another way of doing it is actually to use the inline JavaScript code, you know, and do that, use a regex on that sort of thing. Alrighty, so we get the file content, and then we're calling our child Logic App to do a transform. And then at the other end here, if you remember, we are creating a file. Now, this here we weren't able to use last week because of file system. Now I want to go outbound. Alrighty, so now I can set that. The file name in here was going to be, I don't know if you can read that, but that's saying I want to take a GUID, put .xml on the end, and the content is going to be the body that we got back from this Logic App. And you remember we originally had the XML transform happening in here, and we moved it into its own Logic App. So we can test this now. We'll save this. And what we're going to do is if we come up to and refresh here, and look at our evaluation and look at the trigger history, we can say, see our trigger is now running correctly. This is at the local time at the moment, 2:07, and it ran and it was skipped, which meant that it didn't find anything to process. So if I come back out, again, I can only share one folder or one window at a time in this version of Teams. So what I want to do is I want to find one of my sample files, and I am going to drop that in. So if you give me one moment, I will find a sample file, and here is a sample file, and I will drop that into my inbound folder. So I've dropped an inbound a file in. Okay. Now, I'm expecting this to fail, and I'm wanting it to fail. And there's a reason for it that it will probably fail. And that is to do, ooh, excuse me. That is to do with when we get the file back out, when we get the file content, we need some way of passing that to this Logic App. And if you remember, this Logic App actually takes in we used a schema to say we want to pass in the content and the content type, okay? So in this case here, we're kind of hard coding it to application XML, and we're saying here, I want to take the body of whatever I got here, and I'm interested to see what we get with XML, because this might Base64 encode it. So let's go back to our run history, and we'll refresh that, and we'll see, it ran, and it failed. Okay, so let's have a look and see what happened here. So we've got a file, we received it, and here's all the metadata. All right, so it's giving me the full path. Notice it's escaping the backslashes because this is JSON. And it's telling me the media type is text/XML, which is good enough. It's close enough to application XML. But no, the actual data in the file is not there. It's going to be the size of the file, which is cool. So I could also tell it to actually ignore any big files. Alrighty. So I come down here and I've come through my decision shape. Does it end with XML? It does. I've got the file content. Now, the output here, you can see here's my XML content. Excellent. What's interesting, though, if I look at raw outputs.
So if you just go back to that, you just sort of explain for our viewers why the check if the file is XML was also shown as an error. Because
okay, sure.
That second step is shown as an error.
Yeah, so what has actually happened here? It's saying that overall, this entire action here has failed. There's been an error in here, an uncaught exception, if you like, yeah?
Yeah.
So something happened and we weren't able to continue. So it marks this entire decision shape as having failed. It's basically just letting me know there was a failure somewhere inside this, okay? And
so it's because these things are children of that action.
That's exactly right. So I've got two branches, if true and if false, and it's come down the if true here, and it's run one of these actions. Now, these arrows that you see here, I mean, most Logic Apps developers will pick this up, but the arrows indicate there's a relationship between these two actions. And the default relationship is run this if this succeeds. It's known as the run after conditions. And in fact, when you edit your Logic App, if I was in the Logic App editor, I could come in here and click and go, configure run after. And I can say, when do I want to run? If this succeeds, or if this fails, or if it's timed out or skipped. Now, this is set to only run if this runs, which means that this failed and therefore was skipped. Sorry, this failed and therefore this was skipped. But nothing else in here succeeded. So it marks the entire action has failed. If I had something that said, if this fails, I want to do something else, yeah, then this would have been marked as having succeeded. And we can give an example of that. What we could do is come in here and first of all, let's find out why this failed. So we have called our Logic App and we have passed it content in here, yeah. And we have received back a 500 error, all right, with the word an error occurred, that text. That's what I put in my Logic App, just as my default error handling. All right, and the reason it's happening is that I've expected this to be Base64 encoded. All right, so if I go back and was to have a look at my transform Logic App here, what I'm doing is I'm receiving a request and I'm expecting a field called content and one called content type. And then when I transform it, inside here, this thing here, trigger body content, if we go into code view, you'll see what I'm actually doing is I am Base64 decoding that trigger body. I'm expecting it to be Base64 decoded. And the reason I'm doing that is Logic Apps will often encode things for you if they can't be represented in JSON. It hasn't done that with the XML we've got because we've got quite a small XML file. If we gave it a bigger one, it might decide to encode it for us. You can't control over when it does and doesn't do it. It has certain rules. Logic Apps has certain rules internally to decide. But you've got to make an assumption. What I tend to do with file handling is I will automatically Base64 encode whatever I've got. Yeah, and that way it doesn't matter. So what I'm missing here is coming back out of here and saying, well, let's come back up into here.
Yeah, so
check if it's an XML file. Yeah, and what I'll do here, this thing here, the file content, what I actually want to do is I want to call Base64 encode. And I can find that by coming down here to under conversion functions, see more, and there is a Base64 here, and it will give a Base64 value. Okay, so that's basically Base64 encode, and these ones are Base64 decode. And what I want to do, come back to here, I want to Base64 encode the file content. All right. So the file content is the output of the get file content action. So this thing here. All right. So I do that and I go, okay. So that changes like that. And now we're in that scenario. Now, the other thing I'm going to show is the error handling. So this here only runs if this succeeds. But what I could do is say, well, I'm going to add a parallel branch and I need to tell it to do something. And one of the things I can do is I can come down to control and I can say I want to terminate the logic app. And I want to terminate with a failure. And I need to give it a code and a message, okay? So at the moment, I'm just going to say an error occurred, but I'll show you in a minute how you can get the error out of this and return it, because that's just an output. So I'm going to terminate the logic app. And now I'm going to show you this thing about configure run after and say, I actually want to do this when that one there has failed. All right. I could also go timed out and skipped because they're valid options to have as well. But I'm just going to do when that fails for now and save this. Alrighty. So now what I have to do is I have to drop my file in again. So in order to do that, what I do is I create a new file. I'm doing this off screen, but I'm just copying the existing file. And I will change it slightly so that it's different because I'm going to reuse it. Alrighty. So now I have to wait for this to fire again. It's set to run every 30 seconds. What you tend to find with these triggers is that they often take longer than 30 seconds to run. Because what actually happens is if they run and they think a file is still being edited when they run, then they make a note of that and then pick it up next time. Sometimes it can take twice the length of your polling time. So I've got this set to be 30 seconds, so it can take 1 minute before it realizes there's something here. And eventually, there we go. It's picked up the file. Yep. And it's doing something now. This immediately tells me that it is probably retrying. Oh, no, it worked. Look at that. I sound surprised. Oh, I expected that. So it's called my child app, and it's created the file. So if I go into my outbound folder, which you guys can't see, I have a file in there. And the file is GUID. It's there. It works. It's GUID.xml. Now, if I want to see what this logic app did, I can come in here and I can see what I passed it. I passed it Base64 encoded content. Okay. And all this did for an output is return me a 200. Yeah, because I didn't ask the logic app to do me anything else. But if I go and look now in this transform logic app and refresh, I'll see that it ran successfully. So we called it with a request, the content, Base64 encoded, and the content type. Now, I hard-coded that. You'll remember that actually what we received was text/XML, not application/XML. But
you could have taken that off that.
And I will. I'll take that straight from. I'll show you how we do that. So I've taken that as the input to the map. The name of the map is employees to Contoso employees, and the output here is hold on, transform XML. The output. Where's the output gone? That's weird. Yes, I've got an empty file. So my map isn't working, which was working when we were last running this demo. So something. Oh, I know what's happened in here. I forgot to change the namespace in my file. So that's an interesting one. What's happened here is that my file has got the wrong namespace in it. So when it ran through the XSLT, there was nothing to match. So it's generated an empty output, and then it's just written that out. But it's not an error. As far as the logic app is concerned, nothing's wrong. So if I wanted to know if this scenario was happening, I would need to put a decision shape in here that said, is my output 0 bytes long? If it is, then don't return a successful response. I can easily sort this out by coming back to my sample file, and I can edit it, and I can change the namespace to be what it should be. And I can wait for this to run again. And when it runs, it will work out that it's got the correct file, and the map will run, and I will get correct output. But whilst we're waiting for that, that takes us through the example of picking up a file, running it through a transform, and writing the file back out again. Because what we really want to do is simulate what BizTalk's doing, where we pick up a file, run it through a transform, and then drop it into the message box, subscribe to it, pick it up the other end, transform it again, and drop it out. So what we could do while we're waiting for this to run is, oh, it just ran now. Look at that. So this ran, and if we come and have a look at our run history for this, hopefully this time we'll now see that, there we go. So we had employees coming in, and then the output, we've got this Contoso employees. So my XSLT, what it's doing is it's a BizTalk map. Remember, that's what we started with. I took a BizTalk map and converted it to an XSLT. I think I mentioned last week that although there is tooling to do that, that the Logic Apps team release, it's kind of out of date at the moment. So the easiest way to do it is if you're in BizTalk and Visual Studio, compile the BTM file, and in the project directory, you will find a .cs file, a C# file, and in that C# file, you'll find the XSLT. It's basically, there's a constant, a string constant, I think it is, or a read-only variable that contains the XSLT. So in my map, I'm splitting the name at a space. This is a very basic map, but just showing it what it does. So first name and last name. And I am generating a GUID as well in the map. So those are the things that I'm doing. Right. Now, let's say what we wanted to do after we ran the map. We wanted to do an XML Validate, for example. How would we do that? So what we could do is we could do that in the same Logic app, or we could follow this pattern we've got of splitting things up into separate Logic apps so that we can test them. And we could create a new Logic app for doing this. So we could come into here, and I could come back into the resource group, and I could go add, and I could choose Logic app. And I will call this, I can't remember what we called the other ones actually. We called them Logic. So this could be Logic XML Validate Dev. Yeah, I'll stick everything in the same place. So we'll create that. Cool. It's in the middle of deploying it, and then once it's done, we will go to the resource, and we've now got a blank Logic app. And again, like the last one, we want to receive some HTTP. All right. So if you remember that the output of the transform one is going to be some XML. So what we're going to want to do is do something very similar. We'll assume that we will Base64 encode it, because XML doesn't always sit very nicely inside JSON. So we'll come back to this Logic app. Actually, one interesting thing here is the output of this, that Contoso. Oh, that's the one that failed. This one here that succeeded. The output of this, the Contoso. If we look at the raw outputs, do you notice this? So what's happening here is Logic Apps is automatically encoding. This is what I was talking about earlier on. What the Logic Apps engine is doing is automatically encoding our XML in Base64. I didn't generate this. This is, and you can tell I didn't generate because they've got content dash type. I went with content type without a dash purposely so we could see the difference. They have automatically encoded this in Base64 so that it doesn't break JSON. And when they do that, in the UI, you don't often notice this in the UI because they automatically hide it from you. So in the UI, if I come back out of here, you'll notice that it's saying body and it's showing me the XML, because the UI knows that when it's looking at the run history, if it sees that content type and Base64 encoded content, it will decode it for use inside here.
So it's already recognized that that's happened.
Yeah, yeah.
It's doing it for you, but it
exactly.
kind of, that's a little bit misleading from a dev perspective. The fact that it's
from
done
a
that,
dev
really
perspective,
clever.
it is. Yeah, you got to be a little bit careful with it, because it also means that if I drag this output, put it somewhere else, like into the response here, so you can see that in the body I'm putting XML. But what's happening here is it's automatically putting a Base64 decode for me on this. So if I come back out, you've got to be aware of when it does this. In certain cases, it will put a Base64 decode for you on it. So the transformed XML that's happening here, if I come out to code view, it transforms it, and in the error response, I'm using the body here, the transform XML. And that is not, you saw that the actual raw output 64 encoded. It has decoded that for me. The reference to @body there means that it has automatically decoded that for me. So what I'm getting back out the other end should be raw XML, and I can test that by looking in my output file and seeing whether what I've got is encoded or not. Yeah, what I've got in my output file is decoded, sorry, is raw XML. But we used to have these problems with the service bus connector where you would receive something and it would be Base64 encoded and you didn't realize, and you'd just be sending it all around the place as a Base64 string. So what the Logic Apps team did is that in the designer, they added a little shortcut, which is that when you select data that is likely to be encoded, for example, service bus, they automatically add in a Base64 decode expression for you and then hide it from you. But yes. Anyway, so what we've got going on in here is I want to take in the raw XML here, but I can't because it needs to be wrapped in JSON. So I'm going to come back into my XML transform here, and I'm going to use exactly the same format here. So I'm going to say, well, actually, what I want here is I want this. Okay, so I've got the schema here. Now we've got an HTTP request, and all we want to do now is validate it. So if we come back out here, we will find that we have some under XML here. We used transform last time. Now we're doing XML validation. So what's the content we want to validate? Well, it's this content, but it's Base64 decoded version of that. So I want to come back and go to conversion functions. And I'm going to go Base64 to string. I want to decode it, and I want to take the content here. All right, cool. And then what's the name of the schema? I didn't associate an integration account. Do you remember? That's one of the things I have to do. So what I can do is I can just put in temporary word. Yeah, although it won't save now. I can't save without having an integration account attached. So what I'll do is I'll delete that for now. I'll save the Logic app. I'll come back out here. I'll go to workflow settings, and I'll select that integration account. Alrighty. We'll edit the Logic app, and we'll add in that XML validation again. So if you remember what we had in here, we were doing Base64 string. And we're taking the content, okay. And now we've got now we have the integration account associated, but we haven't uploaded our schema. There's no schemas in our integration account, and we can see that if we come back out here and we go to our resource group and our integration account. All we did is upload a map. So now we have to upload the schema. So I'm going to do that now. I can upload both those schemas. And it's going to ask me to select a file. So let me just find exactly where that file is. So alrighty, so it is going to ask me to upload some schemas, and I'm going to upload the Contoso one first. So this here is the one after we finished mapping. Yeah. So I'll save that. And I'm also going to add in the one that is from before we did the mapping. Yeah.
Well, at the moment, this is just taking the file name of the schema.
That's exactly right. It's using the name of the schema as the name of the file. And I'm going to show you something. I'm going to add another one. I've actually got a flat file one as well. So I use the flat file mapper in BizTalk to create a flat file schema, and I'm going to show you how we can use that. So now we've got all three schemas there. So if I come back into my Logic app here, this one here, now it's not going to appear just yet. What I have to do is save, close the Logic app, and then edit it again. Now when I come back in, I should get a collection of schemas. There we go. Now remember, what am I validating here? Well, I want to validate the transformed one. Yeah. So one thing here to think about is that I've made this a separate Logic app so I can test it in isolation. But XML validation is kind of, in a pipeline in BizTalk, you have a choice with the XML validator whether or not you're specifying what the message you want to validate is or not. Yeah, whether you're specifying the schema name. Now, this is just a value passed in the name of the schema here. What I could do is I could say, well, I want to pass that in as well. I could modify this and say I'm going to pass in the name of the schema I want to validate against. And that would make this kind of reusable. So I could say in here, I've got the content type, and now I'm going to add in schema name. So that. I can say, well, actually in here, the value is going to be a custom value, and I'm going to choose the schema name from here. So now it does a validation against that.
And now what we've got here is a reusable component.
It's a reusable logic app, yeah, for doing XML validation. What we need to add in now, though, is some error handling. So what happens if it succeeds? What happens if it fails? So we'll add some very simple error handling. So I will add in a response on success, and I'll call that success response. And at the moment, I'm just going to return a 200, and the body doesn't need to be anything because this is a validation. I don't need to do anything other than the 200. The 200 is what signifies this work.
That's just saying okay.
Yes, and then but if it's a failure, what I want to do is I want to return, and I'm going to use 500 for a failure. You don't have to, but that's what I'm using. And I need some sort of error message inside here indicating that something has gone wrong. Now, what's interesting, if you run the XML validation action, it returns you some JSON, which is an array of validation failures. That's if it fails. And what I want to do is I want to select some of those out. Yeah. So I can do that by saying, well, I'm for now just going to return the body from here. But what I could do is I could modify this to say I want to return. I could project this into a new array, for example. I could convert it to a single string so that I've got all the error messages in one. But for now, I'm just going to return whatever I got back in. I have to set the run after on this to say I want that when it's failed. And there we go. So I'll just rename that to error response. Cool. So now we're calling that, and that has become fairly generic. And I can now test this in isolation. Okay, I don't need to actually drop a file in. I'll show you that how we do that. If we come back up to our first logic app that we had in here, if I go back to my resource groups, our first one here is we're receiving a file, and inside here we're receiving the file and then checking to see if it's an XML file, and if it is, we're getting the content and we're calling transform, and you would add validate in here. Now, last week, well, earlier on, we showed you how we would split out the transform. So instead of having the transform shape in here, we'd put it in a separate logic app, and we've done the same with the validator. What you could do is the actual control of this flow, you could do the same thing with. Because at the moment, to test this scenario, where I'm doing a transform and then a validate, and then after this, I'm going to publish to Service Bus, I have to always use the file connector. I could take all of this and put this in a child logic app, and that just says, right, pass me file content, I'm going to do the transform, I'm going to do the validate, and then I'm going to do the publish to the Service Bus. Yeah. So why don't we try doing that? If we create a new logic app, so what that means is that this is sort of like the receive adapter we'd had in BizTalk, where we're picking something up, but the actual pipeline processing, if you like, where we're doing a we might be doing a flat file decode or something like that. That is happening. We're going to put that in a separate logic app. So again, we'll create a new logic app.
And this is the whole thing of like, if you wanted to change from file to FTP, then actually all the remaining, what we're doing now is we're isolating that transport type, so that we only have the bits that are specifically related to file are in one logic app, and the other processing logic is in another logic app. And therefore, if we wanted to change to FTP, we could just change or we could just add a new logic app that does that transport protocol. And
that's exactly right.
The rest of the process is completely unchanged. It's already tested. It's already running. We know it's good.
That's exactly right. By doing this, it means that, if you were in BizTalk and you wanted to change from file to FTP, you'd go into the receive location and you change, from file to FTP, and you change some of the properties. But if you're using the XML receive pipeline, you're not changing that. If you're using a custom pipeline, you're not changing the custom pipeline. This is a similar way of doing it. So I don't need the schema name in this case. And what I will do then is I'm receiving some content, and what I want to do is I want to call the I want to call another logic app. So I'm going to call the transform logic app. All right, cool. And it's asking me to supply the content and the content type. Okay, and then it's going to run this logic app for me. And then I want to run the validate logic app. And again, run in a very similar way. I want to pass in the content type. Now we hit a problem with the schema name. We're talking about reusable logic apps. Where do I get the schema name from? What's the name of the schema to use in this case? Now, this isn't something we would solve today, but if you think about how BizTalk does it, it looks up the schema by message type. So you'd have to implement something like that. You'd have to, either have a separate store somewhere that would look up the schema by message type. You could look at what you've received. We're going to hard code that for now to Contoso employees. Ditto, in the transform logic app at the moment, we're not actually passing in. I'll show you in a second, but we're going to modify that slightly. I'm going to save this. I'm going to come back up to the transform logic app.
So that's kind of an interesting distinction, isn't it, in the way that schemas are stored? Because in BizTalk, you compile the schema into an assembly,
yep.
and effectively, well, not only does that schema end up as being a .NET class, and the actual contents of the schema are an attribute on that class, but
yep.
but when that is deployed into BizTalk server, you have the namespace hash. Root node name is the message type name, and that is used as a key to look at the schema. Whereas in this, all we have is a name and a schema. So we don't have that kind of we don't have out of the box that link between the message type and the schema. We have to know, or we have to maintain our
exactly right. Now I've done a similar thing to the transform. Now I've made it generic by saying we'll pass in the map name on the request. I guess if I want to be consistent, I could make that $. I'll make that consistent, and then remove that and come back here and make that map name like that. All right. So now we pass that in. But again, inside our sort of process file content here, in order to call this now, and you'll notice this is now incorrect. What I'll do is I'll come out of there and see if it picks it up. There we go. There's our map name now. And I'm going to have to hard code that in. But ideally, what I'd be doing is I'd be looking that up. So in BizTalk, that's part of your receive port properties or your send port properties, the maps to run. And in fact, you look up the map by the source schema name. So we'd have to do something similar. So yeah, this is, it's not a problem to solve today, but it's one of the things that you could, we could have a step in here that says, we'll go and find out what the map name is and everything like that. Or you could have something inside your XML Transform logic app that says, okay, well, I've received this content, it's XML. From that, I can work out what the message type would be, go away to a database or something and look up the map to use. You can store that somewhere. Alrighty. So XML Transform, XML Validate, and what we're going to do at the end, though, is we're going to return a response. So what I want here is I want to return a success response. That's going to be a 200, okay. Or I'm going to have a failure, and I'm going to return a failure response. Moment, I'm going to make that a 500. Now, here's an interesting thing. What do I return for an error code in here? Because ideally what I'd be returning is what the actual error was. And we're gone from here, transform, to validate. So if this fails, what actually happens is this will skip. Okay, this will be marked as skipped. And then we'll come down to this. And this is saying, at the moment, I'm going to run when this fails. But this didn't get run, it was skipped. So this is where we use this run after if skipped or failed. So I'm saying I want to run if this one here has failed directly because I executed it and it didn't succeed, or it's been skipped, and it will only be skipped if something else has failed up here. I could also put timed out, but I'll leave that for now. So now we've got a logic app that should always return something no matter what I give it, but it's not yet returning what the error is. I'm just going to put an error occurred for now. Alrighty. So I can now call this on its own, and what I can do is I can come back to my resource group here, come back to my main logic app where I pick up the file, and I can say instead of calling this transform, I now want to call the other logic app. Now it's tricky here. I can't, if I delete this, these will automatically start hanging off this. So now I'll come in here and I will add in, and I'm looking for my process file content. That's the one. And similar to before, I want my content to be the file content, yeah, but I'm going to Base64 encode it. So I'm going to come down here to conversion functions, Base64 encode, and I want to Base64 encode the file content. Alrighty. Now content type, I hard coded that last time. I'm actually now going to come down here and I'm going to find the content type. It's called media type, and I'm going to stick that in. So that will give me the media type of whatever it picked up. Alrighty. So now we're calling that. And because I deleted what was in here and recreated it, the run afters have defaulted back. This is set to success, and this one here is set to success as well. So I'm going to change this to run on failure or skipped.
Yeah, that's a bit of a pain, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just something to remember. And you can tell it's done that because now you get an eye and you get a little red thing saying it's running on failure. One thing here is that this is designed to take the output of something, yeah? So it's got the file content, and now the file name, sorry, is the GUID, and the file content we said would be the output of this, except we're no longer returning that. Because remember, what we want to do is we actually want to publish to the message box. So we're going to change this that we're no longer creating a file here, and instead we're going to terminate with success. We don't actually have to, we could just leave it, but I think it's nice to be really explicit about what we're doing. We're terminating with a succeeded. Whereas this one here is going to be terminate with failure. Now here's something interesting that's happened here. This is following the wrong thing. This here terminates success, but this one here, I want this to actually terminate when this errors, okay? But it's following the wrong thing. If you look at the run after, you'll see that this is running after this thing. I don't want that. What I effectively want to do is I want to drag that in there, but you can't. It doesn't work that way. You can't do it. There's no way to change it that I'm aware of. So I have two options here. I can just delete this and recreate it as a parallel branch. Yeah, that's probably the easiest thing to do in this case. But if this was quite a complex shape and I didn't want it to do that, I can come out to the code view. It's called terminate with failure. And I want it to run after this action. I can come out to code view. And now this is a bit messy, but we're now in code view, which is a big JSON file. Here's the terminate with failure action. And you'll notice that in JSON, because you can't have spaces in your properties, it replaces the spaces with an underscore. So the UI, the designer, always knows to put spaces in there. But it's running after to terminate the success. I don't want it to run after that. I want it to run after the same thing that terminate the success is running after, which is this logic app here. So I can come in here and I can say, I want you to run after this. Now, I'm not going to change this just for now. I'm going to show you what happens. I've done that. If I go back to the design, you'll see that magically in a second, it will redraw it. And now we've got these in parallel. And I can come in here and I can now say configure run after. I want you to run when you have failed or skipped. Bang. Now that's gone back to how we want it to be. Cool. All right. So now we have something working successfully there. And we can test this all now. We can try and validate it and everything. We can, by dropping in a sample file again. Let me just go ahead and do that in my off-screen folder. So we're going to come back to our inbound. We are going to what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my inbound ever so slightly, and I'm going to make it fail validation. Alrighty. So I am now going to wait for this to run, and hopefully in a second it will run. In the meantime, while that's doing that, what I want to do quickly is set up Service Bus. So we're going to use Service Bus to mimic the message box. So we want pub sub. We want to publish a message and then subscribe to it. And we do that using topics in Service Bus. We could use Event Grid. We could use Event Hubs. There's a number of different ways we could do it, but we're going to do it this way. So I will come back out to my resource group, and I will go add, and I want to go Service Bus. Service Bus. And what we're creating is something called a Service Bus namespace. And again, follow our naming convention. Now, this name, whatever we create, has got to be globally unique. The name that you give it has a suffix, which is a domain name. So a DNS suffix, servicebus.windows.net. So you can go and look that up. You can get the IP address for that. You could ping it. I think it would fail. So whatever I put in here can't be the same as anyone else. So Service Bus, and I'm going to call it Logic Apps Live, and hopefully no one else has created that, and I'm going to dev. There we go. So it should hopefully tell me that no one else is using that. This is something people do at demos. If I'm on screen doing a demo somewhere and I've said what I'm going to create, and someone cheekily in the background goes and creates it first, my demo will fail because I will not be able to create using that name. So which pricing tier? Well, I just want basic. Actually, no, I need standard because we're using queues and topics, and we need standard. Alrighty, so we could spend a whole session, Andrew, talking about Service Bus and its properties and everything like that, and what you can do with it.
And we probably will.
And we probably will, at least from a BizTalk point of view.
Yeah.
Because Service Bus is how we implement. Well, it's how we implement order delivery and correlation, and all that stuff.
It's our equivalent of a message box.
It is in a lot of ways, yeah. Okay, so whilst that's running in the background and creating, we are going to come back to our, that's our file. This is our file receive. That's confusing. I've gone from the logic app to the resource group to another logic app. So my breadcrumbs up here look a bit odd. So that has run, well, it's running at the moment, and this will fail purposely, but we'll be able to see what happens. So it has got the file content, and it is in the process of calling process file content. So let's just see what that does. Process file content. If I come back out here, refresh, you can see it's running. And here we go. So we've done our transform, and that's succeeded. Cool. And then we've got our transform that's run. And it's in the middle of trying to run the validate. Now, you'll notice that there's a couple of other runs going on inside here. Okay. And what's happened in here is that I didn't turn off default retries. So it's retrying our call 3 times on an increasing schedule. So the validate failed, as I expected it to fail, because when it's come through and it's run, here, we look at our raw outputs, says code 500. So it has failed for what reason? That's really interesting. I passed it the body, and I possibly haven't decoded the XML coming into it. So if we come back in here and have a look at what that was doing, that's finally given up the ghost and it's failed. And if we come back to our resource group and have a look at the XML Validator, here you can see how many times it was executed, because every time it's run, it's done it 3 times, 3 times 3 times 3, so it's exponential. And what's happened inside here, we can see that it's tried to do the validation, and the validation has failed. Could not find schema information for the element AIG, transform employees. Okay, so the validation failed, and it came down here, and it gave us an error, which is what we expected. Okay, and then it's come back out, and remember we're inside the process file content inside here. So what's happened inside here is we've attempted to call this 3 times, and it's failed every time. So after 3 times of calling it, we go to our failure. But this was all called by the receive file, and that's doing it 3 times. We've ended up calling it 9 times.
Yeah, so that's something to watch out for, because ultimately you get charged for every action that
you do. This is all about retries, you know. So what we could have done here is said, well, we don't actually need to retry this. If it fails validation, it's going to fail validation. So I could come in here and say, well, actually, I want to change my retries. Oops, sorry, I clicked the wrong thing. I can go to settings, and the retries is set to default. Yeah. Instead, I could go none, or I could use, you know, fixed interval. I would do 3 of them, 5 seconds each. Alrighty. But that shows that it is actually succeeding. Well, it's not succeeding. Our logic app is working as it should. It's taking longer to run because of all those retries, but it's successfully come through and we've terminated with failure. Excellent. Alrighty. Now we've been able to show that we've been able to create a file and write it back out, and we've been able to show how splitting up your logic apps into smaller chunks makes it easy to test. If I want to retest my my process logic app here, I can just call this directly. I can call the HTTP trigger, and I don't have to drop a file in every time. Yeah. In fact, from in here, I could go resubmit, and it will just run that logic app again. So if I changed this somehow, it would work. Or I could call it from Postman. I don't think we'll have time at the moment to go through and show the service bus stuff. What I was going to show is very quickly inside service bus, we can go to topics. We could create a topic. We might call it, you know, I would call it message
so
box.
effectively, when we create a service bus namespace, we're effectively staking out our bit of turf on the service bus, and then within that we can create topics which are, you know, analogous to sort of queues or some or that sort of thing. Except the difference between a queue and a topic is that every consumer of a topic gets a copy, whereas a queue, it's like each person that reads from a queue effectively they only get that message only goes to one reader, whereas a topic, the message goes to all of them.
And also the queue is sort of first in, first out. Topic has subscriptions. So I created a topic here. There's no subscriptions. I can add a subscription. I might call this sub all messages. Yeah. Max delivery count. So how many messages do I want to get on there? Well, I don't know, 25. Doesn't really matter. Whether or not I want sessions on, we'll leave sessions off for this one here, but we'll just create it with all the defaults for everything else. And it will create it. And once it's created, we can come in here and we can see the rule that is set. There's a default rule. And in that rule, it is set to 1 equals 1, which means that it picks up everything. But one of the things we could show is that when you publish to Service Bus, you could set some properties to say, well, so if you think about if I'm publishing to the message box, I will have context properties, and I could set the equivalent in the message I publish, and then I can subscribe. I can create filters in here, which is similar to BizTalk where I can say, well, I want to subscribe to messages where this value, this property equals this value. Yeah. Alrighty. So we haven't got time to do that, but in the process file content logic app, what we would be doing is after we've done the validate, we would then publish to Service Bus, and then we'd have a separate logic app with a trigger that subscribes using that subscription, and then we'd write it out to file. So we're pretty close, and maybe we'll try and finish this in another session. But we've shown here that how we get the file side of things working, the file system connector. Don't put double backslashes in. And then what we've done is we've broken our file receive logic app down into a child logic app, process file content. So we could easily have another logic app that picks up FTP files, for example, and calls this logic app. We could do that. So we've got this is sort of the pipeline here. We're doing a transform and a validate. And then we would be publishing to the message box. And then after that, we would have another logic app that would subscribe. But now we can start testing these. I can test this logic app in isolation and this logic app in isolation. They're generic because we're passing in the name of the schema. And we talked about how if you really want to mimic what BizTalk's doing, you need some way of looking up the schema or map for the message that you've received.
That's absolutely fantastic overview of how to create a receive port in logic apps. So thank you very much for that, Dan.
No worries at all.
And we will get onto the service bus in the future. Our next webinar is actually more about some of the other technology stacks that are coming along, which is also really exciting stuff that's coming down the pipeline. But from us, so from me, I'm Andrew, I'm from 345 Technology, and I'm with Dan Probert, who is CTO of Atomos. And together we're representing Azure Integration Group. And so, so thanks a lot for watching this one, and we will be with you soon. Okay, bye now.
Thank you. Bye.